Okay. So today we are very pleased to welcome Dr. Joshi, who is a senior research officer with the Global Education Monitoring Report at UNESCO. She leads and contributes on the issues of non-state actors in education and how education is interlinked with other sustainable developmental outcomes, such as inclusive urban development and gender equality. She coordinated the South Asia Regional Report on non-state actors, liaising with several prominent regional partners. She also coordinates the GEM Report Fellowship Program, part of the report's cross-cutting agenda to engage with the academic community. Her background is in educational policy, economics, and public policy. She previously held research positions at the International Monetary Fund and has done consultancies at UNICEF and the World Bank. Her personal research focuses on the system-wide consequences of private school growth for the educational system. Her research has been published extensively in international educational journals. She is interested in improving the measurement of competition and choice and understanding education decision-making and functioning using stakeholder perspectives. Dr. Joshi, this floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Phoebe, both for the introduction and for organizing. I will now share my screen. I hope you can all see it.
Yes, we can.
Yeah. So thank you again for the organizing, for this invitation, and I'm really looking forward to a really lively discussion. As Magda mentioned, this is a presentation of an exploration of the causes and consequences of private school expansion. It is based on two very different exercises. The global trends part of the presentation is based on some aspects of the institutional collective work done by the GEM report team. The research findings from Nepal are from my in-depth research explorations. So these are very different research exercises. To give you first a bit of the global story. The GEM report where I work is basically the global monitoring report on education. We've been around since 2002. Last year's annual thematic report focused on non-state actors in education. And even the choice of this report's theme is an acknowledgement of the fact that non-state actors are extremely important in the education ecosystem. And when people typically think about non-state activity, anecdotally, they think about private schools or public schools often, right? The fact that some people go to private schools or charter schools. Our report followed a fairly comprehensive conceptualization of non-state activity. So, we looked at issues of provision, like what types of activities non-state actors are engaged in, what are the effects of that provision in terms of evidence. We looked at, how this is financed and who is financing. We also looked at influence. So, the ideas, like what kinds of influence are non-state actors exerting regarding ideas, regarding shaping policy, because as we know, the influence of non-state actors is also growing in many domains. And finally, given that there's such a lot of array of activities, we also looked at the governance and regulation mechanisms around this. And of course, there's a much larger and deeper question of are all of these mechanisms fit for purpose? What I want to present to you today is very, I would say simply the global trends around provision and financing. And if you look at this figure, this is a figure from the UNESCO Institute of Statistics, which the yellow line is for Central and South Asia, and there's a light blue line for Sub-Saharan Africa. And all it's simply showing us is that there's an increasing presence of private providers and enrollment. So many more children are going to private schools at both primary and lower secondary levels over time. And this is really prevalent, let's say, in South Asia. When we did the research, at the more global level, of course, it is not, and even if you look at just any country, there's no one type of private school. The dichotomy doesn't really explain what exists in these countries and in the world. Because, schools, of course, vary by their objectives. They could be sort of religiously oriented. They could have like pedagogical orientations. Some can be more of a commercial enterprise. The government can be less or more engaged in terms of funding or management. And, when schools are charging fees, they can be very expensive or they can be quite relatively cheap in the relatively speaking. So when we did this sort of global mapping of what exists in countries, you can find this on this website called Education Peer Profiles on Non-State Actors. What we find is that faith-based schooling exists in such a large proportion of the countries around the world. NGO and community schools exist in at least a third of the countries, and government aid, so government financing of non-state schools also exists in quite a few. But of course, I think a phenomenon of like a lot of interest, at least in Asia and Africa, is the phenomenon of private fee-paying schools where government is not really that involved. And that ranges from elite expensive schools to what is termed the low-fee private school phenomenon. So, let's say schools charging less than $1 a day, or something of that nature. So you really find very different examples, in this in this continuum. In Netherlands, public and private schools get the same amount of funding, regardless whatever their objectives are. In the United Arab Emirates, 90% of the population is immigrant background, and a lot of the schooling is for profit in UAE. In India, nearly half of the students are in non-state schools, and very few of them are government aided, and they really cover that spectrum of poor to for poor kids and rich kids. In Zambia, there was a big movement of community schools, which really expanded, from 1996 to 2015. In Uganda, what you see is, at the primary level, the Church of Uganda owns, a large share of the schools, and at the secondary level, it's more private entrepreneurs, followed by faith-based schools. So just by these examples, you see that it's a very, very diverse sort of type in terms of types of schools that exist. Any questions on this? Okay. I turn you now to just a brief discussion on financing. When we look at government funding, it's something that we also monitor. We monitored it over the last 20 years. The 2030 public expenditure framework says that countries should spend at least 15% of their government expenditure and 4% of their GDP on education. So I don't know if you can see it, but it's it's basically the lower line here. Like 15% is the lower line. It's like 0 to 25, I think, the scale. What we find is that in poorer countries, education is a higher share of the budget spending, but it's a lower share of GDP because there's less tax revenue in poorer countries. And if we follow just the Uganda example here, it's actually on the lower end in sub-Saharan Africa. It is about 2.1% of GDP, which is like half of the recommended value of the GDP spending, and only 11% of government expenditure. So that's the bottom line. Government funding is not enough in many countries. So if the government is not financing it, it has to come from somewhere, and that usually means that it's coming from households. And when we looked at some household expenditure data, what we find is that households are spending over 1% of GDP in many, many countries. And again, Uganda, if you look at Uganda, it's about 3% of GDP as spending, and that is more than what the government is spending. So households are out of pocket spending more than what the government has been spending. So when we look at the types of fees, in this graph, light orange is school fees, uniforms and supplies is yellow, and dark orange is the other costs. If we just focus again on the Uganda example, in private schools or non-state schools, school fees is a big share of the cost. But in both public and private schools, there are costs of uniforms and other costs. So of course, not everyone has that money readily available. So there's borrowing and saving. This is very difficult to see, but the orange is the borrowing by the poorest households, and yellow is the borrowing by the richest. And again, Uganda, what you see is that a huge, over a third of people are borrowing for school fees, and in rich and poor households alike. And when we think about these other costs, right, the cost beyond school fees or uniforms, tutoring is a global phenomenon. This is a field of study that's been pioneered by Professor Mark Bray. And what we find is, in this chart, you see the data from India and China from primary up to upper secondary, which shows that, as you grow older, you're getting more private tutoring. And you see that there's growth of private tutoring in countries like Bangladesh and in Egypt, where 72% of grade 12 students said they were receiving one-to-one tutoring. And there's also a reason behind this. In some countries, what we find is teachers there's a lot of unemployment and low salaries. So, for example, in Benin, 60% of tutors were university students or secondary school students or unemployed. And and of course, COVID must have exploded this private tutoring phenomenon in different ways. One thing I think to note is that in some countries, India comes to mind, the tutoring has grown to such an extent that some of them are sort of abandoning secondary school study and going to tutoring centers and sort of living there for the last couple of years of their schooling. So now that we've gone through all of that data, one of the questions, of course, arises why has this happened? And there are several, I would say, more sort of in-depth analyses on this. But just to give you a few points, I think, of course, it's linked to the country's history, the social education expansion, the level of economic development. And I would say that especially for low and lower middle income countries, one fact is that this there was a lack of adequate government expansion in the 90s and 2000s. While the global agenda was saying we need education for all, there was just not enough of that government supply and expansion. And also it is easy enough to set up private schools. There's not so much regulation. And as we saw in the case of Benin, there are lots of college graduates or others who are willing to work, who are willing to work for low pay, not out of choice, but because this is what's available to them. And when we see how parents make decisions, it really, when you look at the literature around this, it's really quite varied. There's a lot that is, they care about a wide variety of things, right? That everything that encompasses, let's say, quality of education, teachers and class size and, school philosophy and what have you. But also, peer networks matter to parents, religion matters to parents, and so does affordability, right? So when we end up, I think one of the big story really that emerges out of all this is that inequality of opportunity becomes a very big concern. Like there's a diversity of what is experienced by students, which is why we had subtitled the global report, who chooses, who loses, which is a very, it was coined in the US first, but I think that even in the global story, this is a dominant story that comes out. I was now going to turn over to my research findings from Nepal, but I thought, because now we're going to change tracks. Are there any questions that you would like me to answer now? Yep.
No, what we will do, Priya, is
yes.
Once you're finished, we can then just have a conversation. So why don't you just go through your presentation? Yeah.
Okay, sure.
Okay.
All right, so I will try to, so this is my research findings from Nepal. So I started as an economics student. So, it began with this very simplified framing of the issue, drawing on economic theory that, you can imagine that there's a public school, which is in blue in any location, is funded by an education bureaucracy, managed by it, funded by taxes. And because it's the only kind of school in that location, there's a monopoly in that market. And the idea here is that, if a private school enters the market, there's private schools, there's private school associations. The expectation then from an economic theory point of view is that the presence of this private school will now motivate students and parents because they have a choice, they can decide where to go. And it'll also make the teachers and principals, I don't know, more concerned about keeping students, so they'll be more competing in this effective education marketplace. So that's the sort of framing of a public-private education system. I became in this topic because as we saw, school choice was becoming a global trend even like 10 years ago, and two research gaps interested me. I decided to focus on process because in developing countries, Prachi Srivastav had mentioned that there's a lack of sort of focus on analyzing how school decisions are made, how households are interacting. So just, lack of focus on process. And because the competition analysis was really focused on the United States, there was also some argument that we need to have a better understanding of what's happening in the ground, like are schools actually experiencing competition? So that was, very US-centric research. So my main research questions at that time were about parents. How and why are they selecting schools? How are they continuing to engage with the schools? The second was on the public sector side. So, what are they experiencing? How are they responding? And I also spoke to private schools. So, how are the private schools viewing their roles in the system? And again, the benefits and concerns are that if a parent has choice, they will be better able to match the child to the school. They will be more engaged and satisfied. The concern is that, at a system level, they will just be sorting by economic income and ability, this choice, who chooses, who loses issue. When you look at public schools, the idea was that you'll face competitive pressures and maybe you'll do something about it, you'll improve. And of course, the criticism is, and the concern is that it's inappropriate to view education as a market. It's also very difficult to view this as enough of an incentive to reform. And from private schools' perspective, the idea is that they should be good because they'll be responding to what the parents want, and they'll have to provide quality. But the other thing is, if you just want students, you can also focus on getting the most desirable students, right, and just getting your outcomes up. So then that is you can focus a lot of your attention on the selection process instead of the quality that you're providing. When I look at Nepal, where I did my research, I am from Nepal. It's often described in newspapers or from this global centric view as a country characterized by lots of difficulties. It's difficult topography, very high ethno-linguistic diversity. There's been a long, prolonged political instability from 1996 to 2006. It's also is a country of a very high migration with an economy based on remittances. And there have been major governance changes and that world famous earthquake in the recent past. So when I was looking at the data at that point, I saw that private schools are growing, in both rural and urban areas, which is the first graph. I saw that students were more likely to do better in the high stakes exams in private schools, which is the second graph. So 90% of private schools were passing the high stakes exam and only 50% in the public schools. But also what we see in the data is that when you look at disadvantaged populations, the public schools are the ones that are teaching the most disadvantaged people, such as the Dalits in Nepal. So it was already a two-tier system by that time. And of course, it leads to different kinds of challenges. There were newspaper articles on displacement due to shortage of students. Public schools were closing down, and then at the same time you had protests in private schools that they raised any fees to cover their costs. I did my research on in Nepal. I went to Chitwan and Kathmandu. So Kathmandu is the capital of the city. Chitwan is another highly diverse, medium-sized districts, both of which have a fairly high number of private schools. I also visited 5 other districts in the mountains, in the hills, and the plains to see if these issues translate in the different contexts of Nepal. So just to give this a little bit of time, this is my data collection. And I use many data sources. The data I collected are in blue, and the secondary sources are in red. But so everything. So there was a lot of data in Nepal, but most of it did not fit my purposes. I collected some data from principals in Kathmandu and Chitwan, like quantitative data. And then I interviewed probably hundreds of officials, at the national level, at the district level, at principals, and also parents. And with parents, I also spoke. I did a survey with them, as well as I did interviews with them. So it was just a big exercise of data collection to really get at some of the questions I wanted to be answered. And to go to the first question, which was parents, how are they selecting, and then what do they do? How do they continue to exercise choice? The framing of the process of parent decision making is really based on a lot of stellar work by other colleagues, by other scholars. But the idea is that first you have to sort of decide what you want, and then you go about collecting information. then you consider the options that you, of the schools that you have to consider. And then you enroll that child in the school. Then you try to engage with the school, and then maybe you voice your complaints if there are any, and if you're satisfied, you stay in, and if you're not, then you exit, and then you start the process again. You can leave the school, and then you can start the process. You can begin the journey in a new school again. So this is, it's both selecting, and then how do you continue to exercise this choice once you've selected the school. The parents I spoke to came from 30 schools in 6 locations. 2/3 of the parents who came were women. Broadly speaking, private schools, school parents had a more, let's say, higher socioeconomic status profile. They were more likely to be of a higher caste. They were more likely to read or watch the daily news. And on education, I think what is striking to me is this fact that over 1/3 of the parents had never been to school. In the public schools. So when we look at the paper on school selection, I think I wanted to highlight 2 points: the role of money and the role of children. I find that most parents only use informal networks, and their children's interest in selecting a school. The top reasons why they're selecting is really linked to proximity to their home, the quality of education in a general sense, and also English medium of instruction. Another finding, so the choosing cheapness as one of the top 3 reasons is much more of a public school thing than a private school thing. Another finding that I think was a bit of a surprise to me then, but of course, when you think about it a bit more, it's quite intuitive that the children have a strong role in decision making. We're talking about 6th grade, transitioning from 6th to 7th, like from 5th to 6th grade. And if you look at this quote here, it basically says from a mother in a public school that she had no idea about the school. She said that her child said, "I will go to the school," and she asked me for the fees. Then she came back the next day and said the school needs the mother or the father to come and do the enrollment. So then I went to the school and got her admitted there. And this again, by education level as well as by public versus private dichotomy, we see that it's a bigger phenomenon for public school parents. And this is a finding that is actually shared with, let's say, 1st generation immigrant parents of the United States, for example, that you just have to grow up faster. So you have more knowledge and about the schooling system earlier. When I now turn to my research findings on how they engage with the schools once they have selected it, just to summarize it in this graph, I had selected a very diverse group of schools. I was able to sort of divide them into these categories of, good, like very elite, like somewhat elite private schools, the smaller private schools, the ones that were not doing so well, public schools, the ones that were average, public schools. And this is linked to what the district officials were suggesting, the classification was. So just to summarize these findings on satisfaction, the parents who went to these smaller private schools were the most satisfied because they had actually more say in the school system. If they had a problem, they could go to that school system because the private school there, they sort of relied on those fees, so they would even respond to them. When you go to the sort of more elite private school, the parents did not have much of a voice. They were just happy that the children were there, but if they have a concern, they were not really raising it that much. When you go to the sort of average public school, actually the top tier public schools, actually, what you find is that some parents are willing to, express dissatisfaction on some issues. They were satisfied on some were dissatisfied on others. But what I think is striking is that when we consider the tail end of the distribution, the parents who are sending their children to the schools that are not performing so well, is that both things are happening. The schools are not really organizing any sort of parent-teacher discussion, and the parent does not have the time to do this work. And many of them did express their dissatisfaction to me, but it just wasn't part of the sort of the day-to-day or the monthly conversation with the schools. So when we think about choice as an exercise that should benefit parents and empower them, it told a fairly clear story that poor parents are not benefiting from choice because they don't have the ability to pay, to go to a better school, really, essentially. The bulk of my research was on public school principles, and this is I'll just try to go through this as quickly as I can. Again, the economic argument is that a public school feels some competition from private schools, then it affects your public school outcomes. You can sort of look at some quantitative indicators on how to measure this competition. When I look at my outcomes paper, what you find is essentially when you do these analyses at the school level, that the fact that a public school has a very high market share, is surrounded by private schools, is not really helping them on their test scores. It's not like it's inducing like something more positive. And actually, if you're surrounded by private schools, it's likely to have a detrimental effect on your overall outcomes, because you've basically, and I think this is an indication of stratification. So generally speaking, there's not much of a competitive effect sort of outcome. But as I mentioned, I was interested in process. So I argued basically that it's an interlinked process where you'll first need to respond, you need to experience and then respond. And then perhaps as a result of whatever you're doing, it might lead to some outcome changes. When you look at this local experience, I looked at the extent of private school growth. I looked at enrollment pressures. I looked at competition measures that were about, that were more quantitative in nature, but I also looked at this idea that the school official has to perceive this competition. And so if I was speaking to a public school principal, I was asking them, who do you think you're competing with? And they listed 3 names. And if they listed at least one private school, I consider that perceiving private competition. So just to show you that there were more private schools in both of these locations where I was able to do this quantitative analysis. And public school enrollment was going down in, let's say, grade 1, which means that they were feeling a bit of pressure. What you find is that a lot of public schools are wanting to do, and they're doing this. They're implementing, let's say, English medium of education. They're trying to improve the uniforms that their children are wearing. And then they're also trying to improve, let's say, coaching, tutoring for remedial classes and for coaching. And overall, you see these statistics, like over 2/3 of the principals say that they're adopting these measures. And then on the sort of instructional end, coaching for the high stakes exam is more common, but not for, let's say, weaker students or remedial students. And I think, we all might understand that adopting English is sort of a trend in many parts of the world. It's because of parents want it. It makes their children globally competitive, and public schools are hoping to stem the outflow of by providing this English medium education. And this just shows the trends of transitioning. And these are some regression results that show that yes, if a principal is saying that I'm competing with a private school, then you're more likely to send their child to say that you're also adopting English. But when we turn more broadly to this enabling environment idea, right, that if you are trying to compete or if you're trying to reform your school, you need community support, you need leadership, you need resources, you need bureaucratic support. And what I think happens is that on the flip side, you can be highly constrained from the start. You can start from a position of disadvantage in terms of resources, in terms of community support, and in terms of lack of revenue, lacking bureaucratic support. And what that really ends up meaning is that you can't really be trying to do something as ambitious for you as English medium of instruction. And there's also this bigger overarching challenge of politicization of education, which I think is of course it's a global problem in some ways, but it has specific dimensions in places like Nepal. And I think the one of the interesting things about this is that there was such pervasive political influence in secondary education, in education and governance. And Nepal was sort of just coming out of a big conflict situation between 1996 and 2006, that the politics was very much embedded into how the conflict was taking root in the education system. And also what happened over time is that because most of this was happening in the public school system, where sort of political parties were sort of having influence directly, but also through school management committees and also through the school system, like teachers and, every individual was sort of really speaking from their political perspective, that over time, public schools also lost that support, that, they were basically not education places. They were viewed more as a place to do politics by the influential people in the community. So again, similarly, there's a lot of agreement by the public schools that, parents don't really understand much about education in our schools, or, teachers are very politicized in our schools. So this is what the quantitative analysis shows. When you look at what the private schools are saying they're doing and what they're contributing, what I first looked at what they charge as fees, and what you find is that when you are in a bigger city, you have like schools of all kinds of price ranges. When you are in a smaller city, it's much more concentrated, it's much more followed by the community. So it's just a smaller band of fees. When you look at why and how the schools were started, there are various reasons, and I think, I would encourage you to read the papers here, but it's about like why. The why is very much linked to, it's good employment, it's a clean place for investment. The how is interesting because, not everyone has the money. So there's a lot of groups of teachers getting together to start a private school just to earn some additional money. The who attends is, no one is saying that it's only the elite. Like all groups are studying in private schools. I think what's interesting here is the why are they more favored issue. And, this quotation, I think, really sums it up. It's not that private schools are much better. It's just that public schools are bad. And, so they just provide that slight advantage, and, people are more willing to come to public schools. And then I think the question is that they want the governments to recognize that they exist and work to stabilize the sector as a whole. I was getting tired because at this point, because there was just a lot of negative stories about public schools. And one of the papers that I then wrote was about best schools. And it really was about, identifying, can we identify good schools and what makes them special? And so, how do you go about identifying good schools? So there was a survey question in my survey on what are the best schools in your district, name up to 3 schools. So if I'm school, I can name up to 3, whoever it is. It didn't have to be my neighbor, it could just be any of the hundreds of schools in my district. And then I plotted sort of the social network around this response. So the blue dots are all public schools, and the red are private. This is all of the public school, secondary schools in both of these districts. So, sometimes they're referring to private schools, but mostly they're referring to public. So what you find here is that, there's just a very few schools that are referred to like all the time by people, so school A in Chitwan and school B in Kathmandu are basically the most frequently cited best school by all of these people. They were also in my sample for my qualitative analysis. So when I look at, what's better about these schools, of course, they have this prestige, they're actually able to do these sorting things that private schools are able to do. They can be quite selective because, there's so many children who want admission here. What is interesting is that one of the public schools has a strong reputation, and even the private schools in the neighborhood concede that they're good. They're sort of leader schools in our region. There's within school functioning issues, there's like they've made a lot of progress over 20 years that they've been principals in these schools. And they also have a vision for public schooling that it's not just about them succeeding, it's about the whole, you need like many other schools to submit to improve the social status of public schooling. And one part of it is, of course, keep the politics out of the classroom. So, even if I belong to a political party, I don't let the teachers feel that difference. And another is, you teach your own children in the public school you're going to, because then you can sort of show that you also are confident in the quality of the school you're leading. But what I find interesting is that even these schools talk about their issue of not being able to attract the middle class that lives near them. So one of these schools did a survey, and why are we not attractive? And they basically got this response. So first, the schools had no English medium, which was the main issue for these guardians. The second was that the students are children who wash dishes in other people's homes, which is viewed as bad company. And the third, of course, is it's a government school, the social status would fall. So 2 and 3, of course, are the same sort of issue. This is about social status and who your child belongs with. This school, after my conversation, he said, well, based on this response, we added English medium of instruction to our school. So this is how they're trying. When I spoke to district officials in the country, similarly, they had a lot to say about their sort of issues with politics when they're functioning. So when they tried to do some teacher redistribution, they were almost like ready to finish the task, but then there was one call from a higher up, and then that was it. When they were, when they go to any school management committee formation, there's just so much political conversation that's happening. It's the major frustration and constraint for them. But similar to what the best school principals or others were saying, is really this question of principal leadership, right? It matters a lot. Like a school X and school Y have the same level of, let's say, authority from the government, but a school X was doing so much better than school Y because the principal was able to manage this whole situation. The other thing also consistent with what other principals were saying is you have to promote public schools. Even a cook will not work as hard or may even spit in your food if he knows that he's not going to eat it. And the last point was, of course, the collaborative spirit, this idea that you have to work across different kinds of diverse opinions. And then once the political parties see that, then even they will take your sort of progress seriously. I would say that when I go back to the big picture items, I think everything is sort of true. Is there more engagement by parents? Yes, but it's only for a specific type of parent who can be like like say middle class to lower middle class. Is there sorting? Yes, when you have such a system where there's so much private schooling and there's no real government regulation to control this, students are basically sorted by income and ability. Public schools are trying to do some things to compete with private schools, but I would say that by and large, it's very difficult to view this as a market. There's been a historical loss of community support. There's different kinds of reasons the government schools are different than private schools. And I would say private schools also, yes, I mean, they are providing some type of quality advantage, but it's not. But I would say that it's not. And you see the diversity, that there is not all private schools can be super selective, but the sorting and there's like the selection process is of course a concern when more and more of them when so many of them are commercial enterprises. So this figure is of more recent data. So I did my research 10 years ago, so you can see that the percentage of children going to private schools in primary and lower secondary has almost doubled since then. So many of these challenges, I think, have intensified or taken like a different shape by then. I realize it's a very long presentation, but just to end with the slide on reflections on my journey, I hope you saw that it started from this very economic argument and assumptions on competition in the education marketplace and the premise that public schools will learn something, or probably should be learning something from private schools. And just exploring the literature on processes, right? So the more education policy literature and very much from the US and some other contexts is that just that exploration, what they call the black box, really challenge these assumptions. And it sort of, makes you makes you realize the importance of multidisciplinary understandings of concepts such as choice. And of course, once you're exploring these questions in the context and speaking to people, it exposes the extent to which these concepts translate or not. Just to give you a bit of reflection from my end, when I was talking to parents in the private schools, they just had more of an ease and comfort with ideas such as choice or competition, or even a market, right? And then in public schools, that conversation did not happen at all, right? So because it was just outside of the, the outside of what they were comfortable or in the mainstream for them. I think it, of course, really give me much more of an in-depth appreciation of the need to situate findings in history in context and learn and think more about enabling conditions. Something that I had not expected, in the beginning of this process for me was it left me with a deep respect for public school principals. even if the ones that were so-called running the bad public schools, given the sort of what they were facing and what they were able to articulate about what they were doing. And also a strong understanding of the diversity of parents, in Nepal. And I think from a policy type of standpoint, I do work in institutions and think about this. I feel like I left very much with this. I'm left with very much this idea that if you understand the stakeholder perspectives, then it is critical, because you need to make that the foundation for deciding what is needed, and of course what if any of these policy, and then how to make these policy reforms work. So that is my journey. These papers are published. There are 8 papers on the topics that I mentioned here. I'm just leaving you with some photos of the district education offices and the national offices from Nepal. I even had to some of these papers were, there was a lot of load shedding, so no electricity in a number of these districts. So some of the documents were in paper, sort of in paper that we had to go through. And I feel like, one thing, of course, is that there's such a diversity in both the public system and the private system. But if you look at the public system photos here, and these 3 children, they're behind them is just a classroom full of broken desks and chairs. And you, of course, have a much, better functional system, infrastructure in other places. And we look at private schools. I didn't go to the very elite schools. I went to the sort of somewhat better private schools within my communities, and also the far smaller, the low, what you call quote unquote the low fee private schools in the country. So there is a lot out there, and we just have to. I think once you go into the context, you just see all of this diversity. I will end it at that. I realize it was a lot, but thank you. You can. I'm on Twitter, but you can also send me any questions on my UNESCO.org email. Shall we? Let me see. How do I end this? I can't find. Could you please end this, Phoebe? All right.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Priya, for your presentation. And as we said, we will start with first with questions by Dr. Simfri Makoni, and then there were already some hands up. So then I will.
Sure.
Okay, thank you very much for this. Thank you very much. Okay.
To the people that wanted to ask the question.
Okay, thank you very much for this presentation. I've got a couple of minor issues which I'm going to try and raise so that we can perhaps engage in a conversation. When you were talking about parental choices, are there any differences, for example, between the way the fathers and the mothers would make choices about public or private schools? In other words, were there any gendered differences in how parents would be inclined to choose schools? From your data, was there any indication that the fathers may opt for this type of school and the mothers for a different type of school?
Okay. Would you like me to respond?
Yes. Okay.
Yes.
Yes.
All right. It was not, as you might have noticed, it was, smaller studies. I didn't have the budget to do many of these conversations, but 2/3 of the parents who came, right, they were volunteers. The school would call them, and then they would come to the school venue for a meeting, and most of them were mothers. So it was very hard to give that gender difference conversation. But I will say that it was in the private schools, fathers showed up more. So that I think is already a sign that, because fathers are, of course, typically in Nepal, the breadwinners, and, the fact that they would take time away from their job and come was a sign here. And they were more, they shared their opinions on this. Mothers, I think I was quite struck by the variation, especially in the public school system, because sometimes, you did have men come to these public schools, but in one of these schools, basically the house help of that person was studying in the public school. So they came, they engaged, they engaged with me, but once when it came to the issue of can we do a survey and have a conversation, they just like picked up and left, so that happened. And then you had like mothers where I think very much linked to what I was saying here, that one of the slides I showed was that children were instrumental in the decision making. What you find is that for a large swath of the mothers, many of them did not have any education, and a few of them were so embarrassed about this, like as I was talking to them. And this, I think, is about the skill of the interviewer as well. It's not and also how the questions sort of translate to different communities and contexts, but they were still happy. So for them, they were not talking about quality or choice. It was the location. It was close to them, and they sent their child there because they could be there relatively safe in certain hours of the day. But so yeah, I feel like what I find quite complicated is once you go into these more in-depth introspections, it's very hard to make these gender difference discussions. I think the socioeconomic status was much more striking to me than the gender of the parents.
Then you raised a very interesting point that the children were very instrumental in the selection of the schools.
Yes.
Do you have any data that would enable you to see whether the children drew any distinction that parallel the classification between public and private schools, right? When these children were saying they want to go to this particular school, what were the characteristics that they were identifying which would motivate them to go to that school? In other words, how does the public-private schooling distinction play itself out through the minds of the children?
So that's a very excellent question, and it was kind of tricky to go into this from a child data perspective, because of course it's a much more complicated exercise of IRB and all of these things. So I did not do that, but of course as I mentioned, I was traveling the country. I was talking to all levels of children. I would say I met all kinds of children. I met a child in one of the public schools. I met a child, like a good public school. I met a mother. Her child was there, and the child was talking about, and the mother was talking on behalf of the child, that the child until primary school was in a private school, but then they couldn't afford the fees at the secondary level because there'd be a jump in the fees. So the child was embarrassed, around his friends, and so this was a very classic sort of from the parents' mouth, let's say, of what the child is experiencing, because so there was a lot of that they understood the difference, because they understand the difference in social status in their communities when you sort of switch from a public school to from a private school to a public school. So that embarrassment, that fear of how you were going to be treated was very present in the parents' minds of the children. When I was talking about the decision making, so to go to that public school, I think that was about the options you have, right? So it was not about the private to the public to the more expensive private, or even the mediocre, even the average private. It was a choice between that public school and let's say cheaper public schools. So it was like this. So these are like more famous historical public schools, girls only school, the one this quote came from, where the child sort of recognized that this is at least okay. This provides a decent quality of education. But yes, I don't have like much more data on children's decision making. I did speak to 18-year-olds. The first year I went for exploratory data collection, and I must say what struck me is that in these like high value, let's say the best public schools of the country, School A and School B here, the public school, the children I was talking to who sort of stayed in 18th and 17th. Who were 17 and 18, that I mean, they were just so much more dynamic and about the public value of education and how they needed to contribute to their system, and I think that it really comes from being taught that in the school at such a, like really being taught that in the school. But I'm afraid I don't have child data per se. Yeah.
Okay, this is just my last question,
Sure.
statement. Is this statement that I'm going to read partially accurate for Nepal? That people choose to go to private schools, not because private schools are good, but because public schools are bad. Would you say that sums up your experience of Nepal? That the parents are choosing to go to private schools, not because the private schools are extremely good, but because the public schools are not are bad.
I think it's very hard for me to agree. That was a quotation by
Yes,
one
that's
of the parents.
what do you think about
My thing is, just to give you my own personal history.
Yes, yes.
My grandfather was among the first sort of graduating class of commoners who went to high school. My
Yes.
father went to, so that first, the big historic school, he was a teacher there. He was a student there, and I think a teacher there. And then my father, when he was going to school, he was going to one of these historic schools. My mother went to one of these historic public schools, but this is before mass education expansion became a thing in the country. So it becomes very hard, right? Like all of the evidence, whether you look at it in economics or sociology, it becomes very hard to separate it into this bad, the quality point and the stratification point. If children of all social strata were still going to those historic public schools, would it be a different story, right? In terms of quality, there is no counterfactual. This is social science, right? We see what we see here. I would say that at the individual level, you find that one of the principals asked me from the public school, would you ever send your child to this, right? to our school? Would you ever give the child to us to like educate? And I don't have children, so it's easier for me to be like, it's a counterfactual. I don't know, but that's why I brought up the quotations from both the Chitwan, some of the quotations in some of the districts that have actually been quite fierce with this policy. They expect their teachers to send their children to their school. And some of them have even fired their teachers for trying, to send their children to another school. So, I would always ask this question, it didn't make into it's not a systematic part of my analysis, but, there's a question of to the principal, right? Where does your child go to school? And some of them, of course, said it's my choice, it's my money. I mean, I want to send them to X and Y. And the others, though, would say, of course, it is very much about who, your trust, your faith in the product, in your school, the school you're teaching in. So I think that quotation is a partial truth, because that is the reality many of them find themselves in. But I don't think that, but I feel like, many forces use that sentence to then be like, then improve the public schools first, improve the public schools first. Like if you're out to reform whatever, don't target the private schools, improve the public schools first. And you see this in some examples, some models around the world where you see that the public level governments are saying, we will improve the public schools first. But I would say that my own appreciation of this, being from the country, but also thinking about this historically, is that a lot of damage has been done over time. So it's not, you cannot have like a 5-year project and it'll fix the system, And sorry, it's a long-winded answer, but
okay, thank you very much. Let me give over to Mark, because there are a lot of people who want to engage in a conversation with you.
Thank you so much.
Very much. Thank you very much, Priya. Magda.
Thank you, Priya. Thank you, Makoni. Yeah, indeed, we do have some questions in the chat box, but before I ask the questions from the chat box, maybe I will go with Leg Baral. You raised your hand. Please ask your question in person.
Thank you.
Namaste.
Thank you and namaste. It was very interesting to follow your presentation and basically the interview quotes that you brought. I'm not sure what year you took those interviews. And I can also think of like as an diasporic ethnographer who have been in Nepal just last week. I just returned from Nepal last week. And one question that you raised about quality, understanding of quality, basically. And the very fact that there is this screening system, sorting system, and that it is, if they take students by selection, and what would happen, the very good question that you raised earlier, what would happen, all these children of different social strata attend to the public school or one type of school. And then would there be any difference in quality education? That I think, yes. Recently, there are many examples where these public schools, there are different, provisions for children graduating from public school to get scholarship for MBBS or all sort of things.
Yeah.
Because of that, many smart parents admit their children to public schools in grade 8, 9, and 10. As a result, the children have succeeded. They have brought very good quality result, whatever we call.
Yeah.
Although we can very much debate the issue of quality, what is quality education. I do not agree to the present ongoing quality debate that is very much based on the examination system, which was introduced in the colonial period. Although we were not colonized, we inherited that colonial examination system from 1990s, and which still exists. And even in today's examination paper, you can see, answer these questions in your own word as far as practicable. This is kind of mantra or cliche, but nobody answered those questions in their own words. But if all the children went to the same school as I did as a student, perhaps the quality of education would not be, they will not be bringing 90% result, but still they will have a very good quality. So the problem now is the distribution of student. So at the end of the day, it is the children, which family they come from, they decide ultimate quality of education, so far as I understand. But if you go to the classroom, if you look at the quality of learning, I'm really sorry, it has really been worse, as I could observe in my recent visit to Nepal. I went to a few schools, very well-known English medium schools as well, private schools as well, but the classrooms are no different. All these English medium schools also have 50 students packed in a small classroom. They don't have any provision for group work or students like student-centered learning. But again, they are still quality schools and they are producing this exams result. Yes, you raised it, and the question is of affordability and also raising awareness among parents and what actually is quality education and who brings quality in the schools. But if we go this way, in the last 10 years, the number of private schools have gone higher, and Nepali medium schools or public schools have shifted now to English medium, just to English medium. And again, it brings the issue of language policy, language in education policy, and the state have no control over it. So thank you for bringing in a new perspective. It was really interesting to follow. I don't have any questions. That it was just a kind of my additional observation, what I recently brought back from Nepal.
No, thank you. I think it is quite old data. I think one of the reasons I continue to give this talk, I've probably given this talk in some version 30 times, because this was my research. I've done it. The data was collected in 2010, 2011, right? And this is like 4 or 5 years after the Maoist, after the conflict ended. So the post-conflict situation was very present in people's minds, which is why the political conversation was very strong, and a very specific kind of political discussion was very strong in the minds of the national and district officials. But I think what I recognized, right, as I engage with experts in Nepal, and I engage with, let's say, South Asian experts on policy right now in my current work throughout the region and globally, is that these are timeless issues, right? The issue of what is quality and what is equity, like, and that the predominant issue is who chooses, who loses, is timeless. It's a concern across the globe. I think the one thing I wanted to say was what struck me, the reason I have deep respect for these public school principles, especially the ones that were most successful. And it's true that even these principles over time, they could, do They could even the public schools could do some selection because they were getting more than they could handle. But the public schools, the way they talked about it, right? It's also about like how deep you go. But the way they talk about their sort of contribution is that you're taking children who don't have all of the means to succeed in life, and you are giving them a 10-year education or a 6-year education that's actually preparing them for more things. And I think when you speak to the most articulate of these principles, what you find is that they do talk about the limitations of the system, right? Even though we are now considered decent enough in terms of the indicators of exam outcomes, are we really able to provide our children with everything they need? Which is from a global perspective, is something called SDG 4.7, right? The idea that the contents of what we teach have to change to sort of teach about sustainable development, to teach about human rights, equality, and so forth. So I think I think what's interesting is you do have examples like Delhi has changed a lot at the secondary level by putting in a lot of budget and trying its different things. You have the Chile education system in South America, where in 1981 the voucher policy started, and it was very, very pro-private. And since 2008, the system is trying to come back to trying to like redress some of these inequalities. So I do think that there's global and regional lessons for Nepal, and I think that within the country, right? So once you go deeper into a country, I think you do see diversity. You do see efforts of different levels. So that's why generalizations are harder. And but I think that this idea that if a teacher, people would usually start with, if the minister is not sending their child to a public school, then why would I? Like, so if the highest strata of society is going to do a little bit of this effort on public school, on improving the public school status, there's a lot of thought that it will affect everyone else's opinions. Like if people actually take a stand around these issues, then it'll affect other people's opinions. That's sort of what I think is a timeless finding of this work. Thank you for your observations.
Thank you, Leg, for your question. And I will now refer to the questions from the chat, Priya.
Yeah.
So there's a question maybe a little bit related to what Leg was talking about, the role of children. So Mari Haneda is asking if you could elaborate a little bit more on the role of children in parental decision making. Where did children get any information about which school to go?
Sorry, I feel, thank you for the question. The children were not part of my data set. I would say that, my understanding just from what parents were talking about is that this is part of the neighborhood, right? When you have densely sort of packed schools and communities like Kathmandu, children are learning from their neighborhood children. That is the most sort of, easy to access network. And of course, their teachers. So if they're going to public schools until 5th grade, they're continuing, they continue with that network. So basically what's happening is that a lot of the parents are either migrants or, they're moving around and they've come to Kathmandu city, and they don't have social capital to understand from the neighborhood. So the children have to use their own neighborhood, own sort of social capital and their own networks. It's just slightly better than the parents. I won't say it's like a full network, but I did not do the data analysis on children in detail. So it was more a finding from the parent discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Priya. There is a longer question from Kathy, so please bear with me. I will read it in a complete way. Then it makes lots of sense to hear the whole question, and it's about what you've been mentioned, the politics and no politics in education. So Kathy is wondering if you could talk more about the no politics discourse that seems to be cited as an attractive feature of some of these schools. She says that I'm assuming this might be a reference to party politics explicitly, but it's quite startling to see schools make these claims to be neutral spaces at the same time as they are hyper aware of the politics that the school and their students are embedded within. And the example is When you mention how some parents prefer not to send their children to public school as they don't want them being educated alongside marginalized, stigmatized groups. I see these claims of being apolitical in my research on educational NGOs in India too. I wonder what you think the effects of such a discourse are. Are public and private both attempting to self-describe as an apolitical?
Well, this is a very easy question, but I would say that yes, the politics that we were referring to here is party politics. So Nepal has quite a, well, I guess every country has a unique history, but Nepal has very specific influence of political parties. The main sort of three parties are very, very important in the country. It's also a country where there hasn't been, let's say, a stable government. Usually when you think about India or the political economy discussion in India, they're mostly discussing that there's a 5-year cycle of election, and then people get politically motivated around the election cycle. In Nepal, what's happened is that we, for let's say, all of my adult life and my middle school life, we have not had one single government, that has lasted for 5 years. It means that it's politics sort of on an annual basis. Politics for placement, and then local government elections happened for the first time in 2017. So so that means that for a very long time, even though a lot of policies were decentralizing, a lot of the action was really at the school management committee level. And this is a research that's been around for much longer than my published work. That the school management committee, like when they were being formed, it would basically be about, my party's person has to be the head of the ministry, the committee. Someone else's party will have to get then the secretary or the treasury, that sort of division of seats by political party. So that is the politicization they're talking about. I would say that, again, these are qualitative findings and understandings, right? So when I was talking to, let's say, if I go to some setting, some let's say relatively semi-rural setting in Kathmandu, where there's a public school, it looks decent, it looks like it's functional, it's doing fairly well. And then you had like 2 private schools close to it. And when I was talking to the parents in those private schools, they were basically saying, we have seen what happens in that public school, right? We see that, in the afternoons, there's political meetings in those schools. So, they consider that a difference from what they can observe in their private school, right? It doesn't mean that the private school is not political. I do think that politics is part of any organization's running, especially something as complicated as education. But they're talking about very specific things that they feel is overt politicization. But I think, the fact that the public school principal, this best school was saying that they're hyper aware of their own politics, and then so I think actually it boils down to me to management skills, and how do you use these management skills in an environment like Nepal, where people are very clear about the party they belong to, right? And the party they belong to and the connections they have within that party really affects their employment, let's say, negotiations. This is how they portrayed it to me, right? I've never been part of Nepal's system in that way. But I think the idea was that person's experience over 30 years, how they negotiated their terrain. They were very clear on what political party they belonged to. It was also public knowledge. But the teachers there, regardless of political party they belonged to, their job was not politicized, is the point. I think that they were not given extra credit, extra rewards because they belonged to the same political party as the principal was. So this is how I understand it. I think the bigger question of, I don't know if they're really projecting themselves as a political, they're I think the most they're trying to project themselves as is, we'll give you quality education, come and, understand what quality education we're giving you is, that's what I perceived. The politics is my, my sort of analysis, I guess. Thank you.
Thank you, Priya. There are then 2 questions about the role of the English language. One is by Teboho, and the following one is one that I would like to ask. So we'll start first with Teboho's question. Teboho, correct me if I maybe misunderstood your question. So Tabaho is saying that, as you mentioned in your investigation, that there is a certain preference of English as representing quality of delivered education, and reason for choice by parents in Nepal. So Nabaho is asking about the consciousness of those parents regarding the Nepali language. And then if, like most countries in the global south, there is a tendency, right, to promote local languages, but later at the university level, not in K-12. So what would be the reasonable, as the Bajo calls it, choice regarding quality of education?
This is also a very well-established discussion in Nepal, the issue of language policy, mother tongue, because it's a country of such complicated ethno-linguistic diversity, a lot of policies are in place. The main difference, though, is that mother tongue education, right? The sort of understood idea that you should learn in your mother tongue in the early years, and then later on maybe you can gradually add the sort of national language or the global language. I think the main distinction here is that this is only really applied to public schools. So just to give you an example from the setting that I was in one of these areas, there was mother tongue instruction, but the mother tongue instruction was based on the community's mother tongue, which was Newari, which is my mother tongue. But most of the middle class was not in that school. So the kids who were studying in that public school were migrant children whose mother tongue was something different. And there were diverse mother tongues. So, so there was just a lack of application of the mother, like it was not the right, like it was the right idea, but when you apply it, it did not really help the children in question in that school. When we talk about language as a general idea, right, and when you talk to this diversity of parents and principals, and there's a lot of agreement, of course, that English is attractive. English is attractive for many reasons. One of them being that it's a migration-based country now. There's a very high outflow of young people to get employed globally, and then they realize that even to not be exploited, right, in the Middle East or where the other countries that you go to, having some sort of English language fluency matters. So English is viewed as one aspect of the quality, aspect of the quality of education that is needed. I think what is troubling, though, is that there's poor. What is troubling is that language does not signify quality, right? So when the schools were previously Nepali medium of instruction, the teachers actually at least were taught, had been trained and were ready to teach in Nepali. Once some of these schools started doing English medium of instruction, because the government said it's okay to do it now, and then they were also willing to provide some textbooks. But it doesn't mean that the teachers are ready. It's not like you can just overnight turn a system from a Nepali medium teaching school to an English medium teaching school. Even in the schools that were doing this transition, you actually could just take like a handful of students, even do the ones doing it well. You could only take a handful of students, and you could only do it with a handful of teachers, which then like creates sort of separation within the school system once you start doing this sort of transition. What I find in my research, which is also in one of these papers that I've written, that the difficulty of doing this English medium of instruction, it varies tremendously. Right? If you take, again, this like fairly low, very poor migrant student-based school system, the teacher there might be like a good English teacher who's come, and then they teach English. So first, even if they're just encountering 5 or 6 students, they come with very, very different levels of education. And then these migrant students might leave at the end of the year or in the middle of the term and go to some other school, and someone else might replace them because it is a public school system. They have the right to be in that school, especially if there's, very few children anyway. So I feel like this is what the English teachers who I was speaking to told me, that it is just not possible to do English medium of instruction here. And of course, you have the additional thing that you're not supposed to take fees in any public school system. That is the law, the rule. So that becomes complicated because you realize that you don't have the money, but then even to ask parents for that money, it gets very tricky for the school management. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if I've answered the question, but I would say that Nepal is dealing with all of these things. Nepali, of course, is the national language. the local language is important and people recognize it. But English is the language for, let's say, social mobility. That's how it's viewed. Yeah.
I think you partially answered already my question, which was about the language ideology around English, which is a colonial language, obviously in Nepal, and there is an English medium education, and I guess that also, I don't know if English is also taught as a foreign language in some other settings. So while you were collecting data with parents, have you been able to capture like what language ideologies they expressed?
I think I'll basically talk about one public school principal, a public school teacher. So he was sending his child to a private school, and the child, so then at some point he was like, read this newspaper for me in Nepali, and his child could not read it, and he was just stunned because the child was at sixth grade. And so then he got really scared, and so then he brought his child to his school, the school he was teaching in, and because Nepali, of course, is important to him, and Nepali fluency is important to him. And then but then he like switched his remarks completely into, then it became like such a social stigma that everyone was like, what are you doing? You could not even afford to send your one child, one son to a private school. So I think that anecdote basically tells us is that Nepali is viewed as is more comfortable for many people, especially if you look at women, like the majority of mothers who might be from, let's say, like less educated backgrounds, or, I mean, of course, it's a complicated story, but Nepali is much more comfortable to them than sort of engaging in English with their children, right? So once you sort of transition so much to English, they will not be able to engage with their children. But they view it, the fact that the decision has been made, all right, an English medium school they will go to an English medium school, means that they view that as valuable for, the future. It doesn't mean, of course, that English medium of education, it's, when we think about it, I think from a global perspective or from an elite perspective, it is like I went to a private school that taught in English. It didn't mean that we were speaking in English, all the time. Sometimes people would even penalize these more elite private school students for speaking in, let's say, Nepali, right? So it's like really drilled in you that this is not a good thing to be doing. You have to speak, very good English, and it is part of our the shared colonial history of our neighbors in Nepal, not ours, as Lek had pointed out. But I think the issue is that mix of what is the country as a whole doing, right? Because it is really that if you're really training, or if your major job, right, major employment is to be a migrant laborer outside of your country, where it's really not about your skills in that more classical sense that higher education, there's a lot of Nepalis who are in higher education institutions globally, but if the bulk of the population is trying to get private education to go and work as migrant laborers, just some English fluency is, viewed as enough. I would say that the school principals, the school teachers were not very happy with this trend because they recognize the tensions, or like what that causes in instruction, the challenges it causes in instruction. But it is a small trend. I do think that public schools do it and then they reverse it. So there is it's not like steady progression. I don't think it's, because it's something that you have to try and test every year. Yeah, thank you. That's my response.
Yeah, thank you so much, Priya. So we also have a question from Desmond. So Desmond, please go ahead. You can ask your question.
Thanks, Priya, and thanks, everyone. This has been an interesting conversation. Priya, I'd like to make two distinct, but in some ways related notes that I'd like to see if you can respond to. And I say this for I'm bringing this from two perspectives. So what you're working on in the Nepali context is in some ways similar to some interest I've had in some African contexts. So just to give you a sense that these are the kinds of questions I've found myself wrestling with in my own fieldwork. And I do that from the context of comparative and international education, which is my primary academic field. The other thing then is to say that while I'm interested in the Nepali context, I'm using that as a window into understanding these other larger histories. Now, the first side to this comment has to do with a note you made, although I don't think the entire presentation engaged with it fully, but it's a part of your closing reflection, that understanding these issues requires contextualizing the issues within the history, right? And part of that history that is of interest to me, that I think is relevant to data collection, and that's really where I'm headed with this note. The data sources that we're wrestling with. Part of that history to me has to do with the history, the economic theory, or the history of the economic theory that you're bringing to, or you brought to that conversation, that notion of competition. And I wondered how you've engaged with the history of neoliberalism, and perhaps one should say more broadly, the history of capitalism, that framed the questions you even wanted to ask in the first place, and framed the ways you engaged with those you were encountering in Nepal. Now, I make this point because my sense from my own studies and my reading of works in this field is that a lot of the things we report as data do not capture so much of the reality on the ground as it does reality based on the theories the researcher brings to asking questions. Willie Oppenheim and Amy Sternberg did a project in northern Pakistan that they published in 2014, I believe, on gender norm-making and gender mainstreaming. And one of the things they were raising as an issue here is that we've developed a global norm-making idea and structure. And a lot of this is driven by international organizations. UNESCO is deeply involved with this, as I'm sure you know. But in their work, they make the point that we don't often ask the question that's at the foundation of this notion of bringing all genders, of gender parity in education. So we've done a lot to bring girls to school, or to bring all genders to school, but we don't ask questions about who determines the value of education, of the education that we want to give them. Is that something parents are making on their own, or is this something that some researcher like me is telling them they need to do, right? And this would lead to a second issue that I want to raise eventually, but I want to stay on the data question for a bit longer, and that is, in what ways have you been able to, in the context of reflecting on that economic theoretical history of neoliberalism, the questions you were asking of teachers, of principals, of parents. I was going to ask this question earlier, but I'm glad you clarified that the context of those conversations with parents were in the schools. So parents were invited to schools. So that's a very self-selecting group of people who are willing to or are capable of engaging in the school context, in that environment. When I do my field work, I tend to do the opposite, try to go to parents in their workplaces, and if they allow me, in their homes, so people who have roadside businesses and things like that. That's where I tend to want to engage with people. And my sense is that most of them don't seem to have the same set of ideas about schooling that I think are reflected in the kind of conversations we find in UNESCO literature, for instance, and so forth. So I'm just curious about how you're processing the original inspiration for this, that's then shaping the questions you're asking, even the questions about competition, what that means. What was the World Bank and IMF and so forth thinking about competition? And is that really what these parents and schools are thinking? The second part to that, of course, is I wonder if one were to change the question, the primary question here, from private versus public schooling to Western style formal schooling versus other forms of education, what one might find. Now, I understand this was not explicitly what you were asking, but just as someone who spent some time in Nepal, I'm just wondering if the answers one is getting about the choice of public or private school is grounded on assumption of what schooling means, and whether there are other ways that parents explore the the education of their children, raising children to be productive members of society that don't require or don't entail sending them to the four walls of a classroom where they have to learn certain things using textbooks and teachers and so forth? Are there other options? And I say this because I know in the African context I explore, this is a very important, pretty large, but often ignored sector. And I just say one last thing here. That last question I'm asking, I take the note here that the distinction we often make between formal and non-formal schooling is, or can be, an academic framework that most parents don't share, with all the loaded assumptions that come with that. So if I'm thinking in terms of formal versus non-formal, and I'm engaging with parents, I might be cueing them into notions of value and relevance that they might not have already. And that's the level of sensitivity I have, the ways that our own histories as scholars are shaping the data we are collecting and reporting eventually as reality on the ground.
I mean, thank you for your critical commentary on and questions. I feel like I hope you got a sense from what I presented that I started as an economist on this question, which actually means that none of this was part of the first exploration, right? The questions are very much driven by what is understood in economic theory and economic theory literature. Which is why, as the process goes, what I followed was I had done an exploratory round of, thinking, and I went around the country first just to sort of understand if any of these ideas really translate adequately. But of course, the research questions were mine. They were central to me. Right? If in this exploratory phase, let's say I was talking to a district education official and I asked him, what do you really care to know more about, right? And the answers were about, I would like to know more about teacher policy, or how to retain teachers. I was not going to entertain that, right? Because I did have my research sort of focus, which was this question of how are parents making decisions, and and competition. Choice and competition is a very long history of in economic theory, in economics of education, but also in sociology, also in political science. So this is where this framing is based on. When you talk about the levels of sensitivities that you have brought to your research, I would acknowledge that it wasn't there. No, it was sort of an evolving situation with me. So as I went about my data collection, it was very clear to me that not all parents. That's why I've made the distinction. So for some parents, it was quite easy to have that conversation. With others, it was not. The parent conversation was not, a, what do you call it? In a way, like I think if I had a lot more money, I would have probably just done surveys, right? Surveys upon surveys. But in a way, it turned out well that there was not that much money to do this, because the conversation just sort of evolved as we were talking. And, the data collection also evolved as we were talking with the parents on these issues. I think so when you ask me about the theoretical, understanding, it is not about the World Bank or IMF as much as it is, and the IMF is not involved in education policy anyway, but it's about economic theory, of competition and choice. So that's where the theoretical foundations of my understanding are. When you start unpacking though, right, when you start thinking about things like parent decision making, the processes of results, right, this comes from psychological work. That are more about, when you make a decision, it's not that you're not making rational choices, right? You're making choices based on the very few, what you can actually absorb into a system, no? So this is, Kahneman's work on decision making, that you can only, it's not like, you can't just give me thousands of pages of data and tell me to make an informed choice. So this is, where the sort of rational choice argument falls apart a little bit. So I based my sort of foundational, conceptual foundation, as well as my empirical work, on what I understood from both the theory, from economics, and these processes focused, literature. I think, of course, parents are not thinking what international organizations are thinking. That distance, or what economic theory is thinking, right? So when you do process focused work, you have to really be aware of this. But parents are thinking, as a lot of others are thinking, about their children's future. They're thinking about their employment opportunities, their marriage prospects. They're thinking about all of these things. So in that sense, there are some deeper questions here about whether is this the real truth of the situation, right? That you are trying to ask me. And of course, the what ends up in my 7,000 word paper is not the full reality that I experienced, or what was what the parents sort of conveyed to me. But I would say, it captures, given as my sensitivities were evolving, it captures that. Let's say it captures, that nuanced reflection on these issues. Of course, I have this other the other level of sensitivity I have to bring to this is, I'm from Kathmandu city. I know I'm educated abroad, right? I mean, I am not your average Nepali woman, so when people saw me, they of course othered me immediately. It's not so easy to just be a data collector. Of course, I'm not, like a foreigner in this situation, but I'm foreign, I'm foreign, quite foreign. And that quite foreign yields like different kinds of responses, right? One is more the foreign that you are not willing to, you're not interested in talking to me because, or, there's a bit of a guarded response to what I'm talking to you about. But the other, it yielded, which is, I think, also, maybe just because it's been a country that is heavily influenced by donors and, the like, that there was also, let's say, an eagerness to talk to me. I don't think the questioning was very much about what they were trying to get, from education systems. So the parents' conversation in particular is very specific. It's about like, what do they want out of schools? What did they look at? Like, did they look? So it was very about their process. And of course, they can sort of, massage that into a story that they think they need to tell someone like me. But after a period of time, it's not so easy, right? So, I mean, it is not ethnographic work, right? It's basically case study analysis. So I would say that that limitation, of course, exists. But it was, from the study as it was designed to the study what it became, it is quite an evolution. So I would say that you will find very few economists like me out and about, I think. That's where I'll leave it. Thank you.
I appreciate that. And if I might take a minute or two again, Magda, just to say one more thing. And I just say this from the context of the work I do. I appreciate that, that continued reflection on your own trajectory in wrestling with this. Because my sense is, in engaging with the history of neoliberalism and of capitalism, the financial institutions and Western governments that were deeply invested in enthroning that ideology, I don't think that they were thinking in terms of equity in the ways that would benefit the average Nepalese citizen or the average person in Kathmandu, quite frankly. And we have data on this, not just from critics outside, but also critics inside the World Bank and IMF. And I think IMF was directly involved, as was the World Bank, in that movement, during the Reagan and Thatcher administrations. And I say this because recognizing that, the neoliberalism became adopted in education policy, but I don't think it was created for education. I think it's much larger than that. And these institutions were involved in that. I see this at work even going back to the structural adjustment programs. These things were not contrived in the interest of the regular person in the non-Western society, or even in the Western society, quite frankly. And for that reason, I think what has been striking to me in the ways that I've tried to ask the question, I'll use both education and language to highlight this, and what I'm finding is that parents, like you were suggesting, do engage in choice making very actively. And I think there is a tendency for researchers, this was part of what I was reading before I went into this, and I was actually doing that work in India, in Nigeria, and some other places, in 2009, 2010. So around the same time that I think you were also getting into that this process in Nepal. The literature I was reading there often, suggested what I might call an ignorance thesis. The parents are ignorant about XYZ. It's usually ignorant about the value of schooling, or ignorant about these linguistic choices and so forth. But what I found when I started paying attention to my own questions and the ways that my questions were determining what I was finding, is that if I changed the question I was asking, it was clear to me that parents were not ignorant at all. They understood the volatile political and economic context out of which they were functioning. So for instance, if you asked parents simply, what school would you like to go to, right? It might be easy for a parent to say that school over there or this other school there based on what they think will give their child a better shot, right? If you were to change the question to what school would you like to, or what would you like for your child to know or to do, if you could set up the society in the way you really would like, the equation changes completely. The same with language. A parent might tell you, I want my child to go to an English medium school, right? But if you ask the parent a different question, that is, if you were to organize society in the way that makes sense to you, in the ways that, you know, getting a job was not tied to whether you could speak English or not, at least as people think about it, you know, what would be parents' preferences? And usually their preference was not an English medium school. It wasn't also an indigenous medium school. That is, the preference for language was not a zero-sum calculus. I think parents were as open to their child learning and using the indigenous language as they were with English, which was very far from what the literature was saying. So my sense is that I recognize now the ways that most of us, just based on our learning and our schooling, just bring assumptions about what should be or could be happening, and then we elicit from our participants this. It's actually forced me to be a bit more introspective in my work, rather than go to try to gather data to speak to what is happening. I go to those contexts for them to inform my understanding. So I'll just sort of begin to recover some of the lost trajectories or lost, directions I've had. I think that's where I am right now, before even beginning to deepen my own understanding of what's happening in the context in such that I will be able to speak about them more clearly. But thank you so much for this. It's been very, very enlightening.
Thank you, Desmond, for sharing your own research approach and your comments. I don't know if you have any comments, Priya, but we have one more question before we finish the formal session. That's from Sangeeta. So she has two questions. She says, Namaste and thanks, Priya. You made an important point regarding different types of non-state schools, where you pointed to 3 types. And Sangeeta says, I miss language profile schools in that typology. Do language profile schools other than English exist in Nepal? And then Sangeeta has another interesting question. She says, I have learned a number of different signed languages in Nepal, in addition to Nepali Sign Language. Are there different signed language schools you are aware of?
Well, I feel like it's easy enough for me to answer this question because, the different typologies of Nepal, there's government documentation on what this is, right? Because typology is based on specific government requirements on how one defines, let's say, how a government finances, how a government sort of views a school. So it's actually very hard to get data that is as specific as language profile. It would not really exist, unless you do a fairly strong national survey. And even then, of course, the specificity of that would be quite hard, right? Because you'd have to ask the right questions. As Desmond was saying, everything is about how you're asking these questions. Are you asking questions about, the number of countries? What do you mean by language profile school? A school that teaches mother tongue, a school that teaches English, a school that teaches in Nepali. It all requires surveys. As far as I know, at the government level, the main distinctions are about whether a government is paying or not paying, or whether the government is managing or not managing that school. And similarly, I think languages. I don't know enough about sign language and the details of what kinds of language exist in Nepal, because this is not, let's say, an area of my research, but also as government data, it doesn't exist as much. I think one of the other challenges with the whole question of people with special needs, which is something that we covered in the Global Report on Inclusion, is that there's actually quite a big movement to not have these disaggregated categories. because you actually want to have more as many of the students engaged in let's say what is quote unquote a mainstream school as possible, with with sort of more of an inclusive approach to education. So that also I think is challenging, like the data we can gather on these issues. So I feel like every country is improving their data on maybe what kinds of needs children have, and how to like identify them early. But I think school systems wise, the bigger approach is how do we make it more inclusive, except let's say, and then the other sort of approach is the German sort of approach, where you keep the children separate and make sure that special needs education teaches you what you need for the rest of your life. So yeah, I think I don't know enough about the Nepal situation on these issues. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Priya. We will stop the formal part, but Michael, you can ask your questions still in the after party. So please stay with us. Makoni,